All right, my name is Mackenzie, and I'm going to go over Chinese border crossing during the Chinese Exclusion Acts. The Chinese Exclusion Act was signed by President Arthur in 1882, and the purpose of the act was to suspend Chinese immigration for 10 consecutive years. This was the first time that a law was created to prevent an entire ethnic group of people from coming into the U.S. The main concern was the amount of Chinese laborers coming over to America and staying in America. Originally, Chinese laborers were welcomed, but when the railroads were complete and the gold rush ended, the demand for laborers decreased drastically. Americans blamed the Chinese for minimum wage and lack of jobs. Chinese who had already immigrated to the U.S. were fine to stay, but if they decided to travel outside the U.S., they had to get certificates from the government if they wanted to re-enter. After only 6 years, did Congress just cancel these certificates with the Scott Act. So if you travel outside the U.S., you would have an incredibly hard time re-entering. When the 10 years passed, U.S. Congress signed the Geary Act, which extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for an additional 10 years. Then just 2 years later, Congress made the Chinese Act permanent and began to require Chinese immigrants obtain certification of residency, and without certification, they faced deportation or prison time. So between 1882 and 1943, when immigration was supposed to be suspended, it actually increased pretty drastically. Illegal immigration, that is. If a Chinese person wanted to come to the United States for, say, family or work or to start a new life, they would basically have to do it illegally. With U.S. Border Patrol cracking down, Chinese immigrants had to get creative by avoiding U.S. Border Patrol altogether. There were a lot of ways to do this, since Americans often saw the possibility in making profit by helping a Chinese person over the border. You can also, walk over the borders and try to blend in with the Chinese population already in America, but that was incredibly risky and it took a lot of time. The Mexican and Canadian borders were really popular ports of entry. Immigrants traveled via train, hiding in freight cars that happened to be bonded with U.S. Customs seals were actually untouchable by Border Patrol, so that was a pretty preferred method. Other ways were by boat. If you're traveling by boat from another country, you could potentially get hired on a ship as a deck mate, someone who works on the boat, and then once you reach these American ports, you would again try and slip away and blend into the Chinese that are already in America. There were tons of ways for illegal immigration to happen back then, and it did happen, and it still does happen. We experience a lot of immigration today that's undocumented, and there have been, ways to try and stop this, but I think that regardless of everything, if it weren't for the Chinese Exclusion Acts, America today would be an incredibly different place. I do think that the acts were this foundation that built our views on immigration to America, and it kind of set the standard and made guidelines for the government to set up immigration standards. So, but that's all I have on Chinese border crossing during the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Thanks.